Sarah Martinez had been attending St. Michael's Lutheran Church for 37 years. Every Sunday morning, she'd sit in the third pew from the front, right side, next to the stained glass window depicting the resurrection. Her grandmother sat there before her, and her great-grandmother before that. 3 generations of unwavering faith until one cold February morning in 2019 when Sarah walked out of those familiar wooden doors and never returned. She wasn't alone. That same year, over 2 million Americans would make the same decision. But Sarah's story began decades earlier, rooted in a pattern that most church leaders either couldn't see coming or refused to acknowledge until it was too late. In 1972, when Sarah was just 8 years old, 87% of Americans identified as Christian. Churches weren't just places of worship, they were community centers, social hubs, and moral compasses that guided entire neighborhoods. Fast forward to today, and that number has plummeted to just 63%, representing the most dramatic religious shift in American history. But the statistics only tell part of the story. The real narrative lies in the countless individual moments of disillusionment, betrayal, and abandonment that have accumulated like cracks in a foundation until the entire structure began to crumble. The first crack appeared in Sarah's faith during the 1980s Catholic sexual abuse scandals. Even though she wasn't Catholic, news reports of priests abusing children while church hierarchies covered up their crimes sent shockwaves through all Christian denominations. Trust, once freely given to religious institutions, suddenly required proof. When the Boston Globe's Spotlight investigation revealed that over 70 priests in Boston alone had molested children, and Cardinal Bernard Law had systematically concealed these crimes for decades, it wasn't just the Catholic Church that suffered. A 2018 study by the Public Religion Research Institute found that 34% of Americans, regardless of denomination, reported that clergy sexual abuse scandals had negatively impacted their faith in religious institutions overall. But scandals were just the beginning. The real abandonment started with a slow erosion of relevance that many church leaders failed to recognize until their pews were half empty. Pastor David Chen of Riverside Community Church in Ohio watched his congregation shrink from 800 members in 2005 to just 230 by 2020. The decline wasn't sudden. It was a steady hemorrhaging that he initially attributed to normal demographic shifts. Then he started paying attention to the exit interviews. What he discovered challenged everything he thought he knew about modern Christianity. People weren't leaving because they'd lost faith in God, Pastor Chen explains. They were leaving because they'd lost faith in the church as an institution. There's a profound difference. The data supports his observation. According to the Pew Research Center's 2021 study on religious switching, 47% of Americans who left organized religion still consider themselves spiritual or believe in God. They haven't rejected faith. They've rejected the institutional packaging that surrounds it. This distinction is crucial to understanding the current crisis facing American churches. Consider the story of Michael Thompson, a construction worker from Tennessee who attended the same Baptist church for 22 years. Michael's breaking point came during the 2016 election cycle when his pastor began endorsing political candidates from the pulpit. "I didn't go to church to be told how to vote," Michael recalls. "I went to find peace, community, and spiritual guidance. When my pastor started spending more time talking about politics than preaching about love and forgiveness, I knew it was time to leave." Michael's experience reflects a broader trend. The Pew Research Center found that 54% of Americans believe churches should stay out of political matters, yet increasingly religious institutions have become more politically active. This politicization has created an uncomfortable tension for congregants who view their faith as separate from their political beliefs. In 2020, a significant number of churches endorsed candidates, distributed voter guides, and hosted political rallies, actions that drove away members seeking spiritual rather than political guidance. The generational divide adds another layer of complexity to this crisis. Millennials and Generation Z, who came of age during an era of institutional distrust following events like the Enron scandal, the 2008 financial crisis, and widespread political corruption, approach religious institutions with inherent skepticism. Unlike previous generations who accepted religious authority largely without question, younger Americans demand transparency, accountability, and relevance. Emma Rodriguez, a 28-year-old software engineer from Austin, represents this generational shift perfectly. Raised in a devout Methodist family, Emma attended church regularly until college. The church I grew up in felt completely disconnected from the real world, she explains. They preached about helping the poor while spending millions on elaborate buildings. They talked about love and acceptance while condemning my gay friends. The hypocrisy became impossible to ignore. Emma's criticism touches on one of the most significant factors driving people away from churches: the perceived gap between Christian teachings and institutional behavior. A 2019 study by the Barna Group found that 68% of young adults view Christianity as hypocritical, citing examples like wealthy megachurch pastors living lavish lifestyles while their congregations struggle financially, or churches preaching inclusion while practicing exclusion. The financial aspect of modern Christianity has become particularly problematic. Televangelists like Joel Osteen, who lives in a $10.5 million mansion while asking for donations from financially struggling viewers, have created a public relations nightmare for all Christian denominations. When Hurricane Harvey flooded Houston in 2017, Osteen's Lakewood Church initially refused to serve as a shelter, generating massive backlash and reinforcing perceptions of religious hypocrisy. Although the church eventually opened its doors, the damage to its reputation was significant and reflected poorly on Christianity as a whole. The prosperity gospel movement, which teaches that financial success is a sign of God's favor, has particularly alienated working-class and lower-income Americans. This theology suggests that poverty results from insufficient faith, a message that feels both cruel and disconnected from reality for families struggling economically. Dr. Kate Bowler, a Duke University professor who studies the prosperity gospel, notes that this theology has turned Christianity into a spiritual vending machine where faith becomes currency for earthly rewards. But the exodus from churches isn't solely driven by institutional failures. Broader cultural and technological changes have fundamentally altered how people seek and find community, meaning, and spiritual fulfillment. The internet has democratized access to spiritual content and religious teaching. Why attend a potentially disappointing local service when you can watch inspiring sermons from world-renowned pastors online? Platforms like YouTube, Spotify, and dedicated religious apps offer unlimited access to spiritual content that can be consumed on personal schedules without the social obligations and potential conflicts that come with institutional membership. Dr. Rachel Wagner, a scholar of religion and digital culture at Ithaca College, argues that digital technology has created spirituality without commitment. People can maintain their faith while avoiding the interpersonal friction, financial obligations, and institutional politics that characterize traditional church membership. This trend has accelerated dramatically since the COVID-19 pandemic forced religious services online, proving that many spiritual needs can be met without physical church attendance. Hey everyone, welcome back to Professor Archive, where we dive deep into the historical forces shaping our world today. If you're just joining us, we're exploring one of the most significant social transformations of our time: why millions of Americans are walking away from their churches. I'm curious about our global audience today, so drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. Are you a teacher, healthcare worker, student, or something else entirely? I love hearing about the diverse perspectives our community brings to these discussions. The COVID-19 pandemic acted as an unexpected catalyst, accelerating existing trends rather than creating new ones. When churches were forced to close their doors in March 2020, many discovered that their spiritual needs could be met through live-streamed services, online prayer groups, and virtual Bible studies. For some, this digital transition was temporary. For others, it became permanent. Trinity Episcopal Church in Denver provides a stark example of this shift. Before the pandemic, they averaged 400 attendees across 3 Sunday services. When they reopened in late 2020, only 120 people returned to in-person worship, despite maintaining a healthy online viewership of over 600. Pastor Jennifer Walsh notes that many congregants explicitly told her they preferred the convenience and flexibility of digital worship. They could participate in our services while drinking coffee in their pajamas, without worrying about childcare, parking, or social obligations, Pastor Walsh explains. For busy families, especially those with young children or aging parents, online worship eliminated significant barriers to participation. However, this digital transition also eliminated many traditional revenue streams. Churches rely heavily on in-person giving, and online donations typically generate only 20 to 30% of previous physical collections. As attendance declined, so did financial support, creating a vicious cycle where churches had to cut programs and staff, making them even less attractive to potential members. The economic impact extends beyond individual churches to entire denominations. The United Methodist Church, America's second largest Protestant denomination, has lost over 2 million members since 2009, forcing the closure of thousands of congregations and the consolidation of others. The Presbyterian Church, USA, has experienced similar declines, shrinking from 2.8 million members in 2000 to just 1.2 million in 2021. These aren't just numbers. They represent communities, traditions, and social support systems that have provided stability for generations. When rural churches close, they often take with them the last gathering place for small communities. When urban churches consolidate, they lose the intimate neighborhood connections that once made them irreplaceable parts of the social fabric. The scandal factor cannot be understated in driving this exodus. Beyond the widely reported Catholic abuse crisis, numerous Protestant denominations have faced their own institutional failures. The Southern Baptist Convention, America's largest Protestant group, has been rocked by revelations of widespread sexual abuse and cover-ups. An independent investigation released in 2022 detailed how denominational leaders systematically silenced victims and protected predators for decades. Krista Brown, an abuse survivor and advocate, describes the psychological impact. When the institution that's supposed to represent God's love on earth becomes the source of your deepest trauma, it doesn't just damage your relationship with that church. It damages your ability to trust any religious institution. The financial scandals have been equally damaging. Jerry Falwell Jr.'s downfall at Liberty University involved not just personal moral failures, but also questionable financial dealings and misuse of university resources. Hillsong Church, once a global megachurch phenomenon, collapsed amid financial impropriety and abuse allegations against founder Brian Houston. These high-profile failures reinforce public perceptions that religious institutions prioritize money and power over spiritual integrity. Perhaps most significantly, many churches have struggled to address contemporary social issues in ways that resonate with younger generations. The Black Lives Matter movement created particular tension within multiracial congregations, where white and black members often held vastly different perspectives on issues of race and justice. Churches that remained silent on racial inequality alienated many black members, while those that spoke out sometimes lost white congregants who preferred their religion to avoid controversial topics. LGBTQ+ issues have created similar divisions. Churches that maintain traditional stances on sexuality and gender have lost many younger members who view these positions as discriminatory. Meanwhile, churches that have become affirming often face backlash from traditionalist members and potential schism from their denominations. The United Methodist Church has been particularly torn by this issue, with entire conferences threatening to leave the denomination over LGBTQ+ ordination and marriage policies. Women's roles in church leadership continue to be a source of tension in many denominations. Despite comprising the majority of regular churchgoers, women still face significant barriers to leadership in many Christian traditions. The Southern Baptist Convention's 2022 decision to expel several churches for having female pastors alienated many members who viewed this action as outdated and discriminatory. Beth Moore, one of evangelical Christianity's most prominent female teachers, left the Southern Baptist Convention citing the denomination's treatment of women and racial minorities. The abortion debate has created additional complications for churches trying to maintain unity among diverse congregations. While many conservative Christians view opposition to abortion as a fundamental religious principle, surveys indicate that a significant percentage of churchgoers support some level of reproductive choice. Churches that take strong political stances on abortion often find themselves alienating members whose personal experiences or beliefs don't align with official positions. Economic factors have also played an underappreciated role in church abandonment. As income inequality has increased, many working-class Americans have become uncomfortable with churches that seem to cater primarily to middle and upper-class members. Tithing expectations, building fund campaigns, and social activities that assume disposable income can make economically struggling families feel unwelcome or inadequate. The phenomenon known as church shopping has become increasingly common, with families trying multiple congregations before settling on one that meets their needs, or eventually giving up the search entirely. This consumer approach to religion reflects broader cultural shifts toward individualism and personal choice, but it also indicates that traditional denominational loyalty has largely disappeared. Climate change presents another challenge for traditional churches. Younger generations, particularly those concerned about environmental issues, sometimes view churches as inadequately engaged with what they consider the moral crisis of our time. While some denominations have embraced environmental stewardship as a religious imperative, others have remained largely silent on climate issues or, in some cases, have actively opposed environmental regulations. The rise of non-denominational churches initially appeared to offer a solution to some of these problems by avoiding traditional institutional baggage and focusing on contemporary worship styles and practical life applications. However, many of these churches have faced their own scandals and leadership failures, from Mark Driscoll's authoritarian behavior at Mars Hill Church to Carl Lentz's moral failures at Hillsong NYC. International perspectives add another dimension to understanding church abandonment. European countries experienced similar religious declines decades earlier, providing a potential preview of America's future. In countries like Sweden, Germany, and the United Kingdom, churches now serve primarily ceremonial functions for weddings, funerals, and holidays, while playing minimal roles in daily spiritual life. The spiritual but not religious category has become the fastest-growing religious identification in many Western nations. However, the American situation has unique characteristics that distinguish it from European secularization. American civil religion, the quasi-religious reverence for national symbols and history, has become increasingly politicized, creating additional tension within churches. When religious and political identity become too closely intertwined, people who disagree with the political messages often feel compelled to leave the religious community entirely. The mental health aspect of church abandonment deserves serious consideration. For many people, religious communities provide crucial social support, meaning-making frameworks, and coping mechanisms during difficult times. When people leave churches, they often lose these benefits without finding adequate replacements. Studies have consistently shown correlations between religious participation and positive mental health outcomes, though causation remains debated among researchers. However, toxic church environments can also damage mental health. Spiritual abuse, defined as the misuse of religious authority to control or manipulate others, has become increasingly recognized as a serious problem. People who experience spiritual abuse often struggle with religious trauma that can take years to overcome. Online communities like evangelical support groups provide spaces for people processing these experiences, but they also represent thousands of individuals who may never return to institutional religion. The education factor cannot be ignored. Higher education levels correlate with decreased religious participation, though the reasons for this relationship are complex and disputed. Some argue that exposure to diverse ideas and critical thinking skills naturally leads to religious skepticism. Others contend that universities create environments hostile to traditional religious beliefs. Regardless of the cause, the increasing percentage of Americans with college degrees has contributed to overall religious decline. Geographic patterns also emerge in church abandonment data. Rural churches face unique challenges as young people migrate to urban areas for economic opportunities, leaving behind aging congregations with limited resources. Urban churches, while often more financially stable, must compete with numerous alternative social and cultural activities for people's time and attention. The generational wealth gap has religious implications that often go unrecognized. Older generations, who tend to be more religious, control the majority of church assets and leadership positions. Younger generations, facing student debt, housing costs, and economic uncertainty, may view churches as institutions primarily serving the interests of older, wealthier members. This perception creates barriers to engagement, even among young people who might otherwise be interested in religious participation. Technology companies have begun recognizing and capitalizing on spiritual needs that traditional churches aren't meeting. Apps like Pray.com, Bible.com, and Calm offer spiritual content and meditation practices that can be accessed anywhere, anytime. These platforms provide personalized spiritual experiences without the social complications or institutional commitments of traditional church membership. The questioning of biblical authority has accelerated with increased access to information about biblical scholarship, archaeology, and comparative religion. When people learn about the historical development of biblical texts, the diversity of early Christian beliefs, or the similarities between Christianity and other ancient religions, some experience crises of faith that lead them away from traditional churches. Seminary-trained pastors often possess this knowledge but may be reluctant to share it with congregations, creating a knowledge gap that can feel like deception when discovered independently. For many former churchgoers, the final straw comes not from major scandals or theological disagreements, but from accumulating small disappointments and frustrations. Poor leadership, interpersonal conflicts, boring services, irrelevant preaching, financial mismanagement, or simply feeling invisible within the congregation can gradually erode commitment until leaving feels like the only viable option. The social justice awakening of recent years has created additional tensions within churches. Many younger Christians have embraced social justice as fundamental to their faith, viewing issues like racial equality, economic justice, and environmental protection as religious imperatives. However, older church members sometimes view these concerns as political distractions from traditional spiritual priorities. These generational differences in understanding Christianity's social responsibilities have contributed to ongoing conflicts and departures. Child-rearing practices represent another area of tension. Many parents who grew up in strict religious environments choose to give their children more freedom to explore different beliefs and make their own spiritual choices. While this approach reflects admirable respect for individual autonomy, it often results in children who never develop strong connections to religious institutions and are more likely to identify as religiously unaffiliated as adults. The rise of alternative spirituality practices, from meditation and yoga to astrology and crystals, provides spiritual experiences outside traditional religious frameworks. While churches have sometimes attempted to incorporate these practices, theological constraints often limit their ability to fully embrace alternative spiritual approaches. As a result, people seeking these experiences often find them in secular or explicitly non-Christian contexts. Professional considerations also factor into church attendance decisions. In increasingly diverse workplaces, strong religious identification can sometimes create professional complications or social awkwardness. Some people find it easier to maintain vague spiritual beliefs rather than commit to specific religious institutions that might be viewed negatively by colleagues or clients. The entertainment industry has played an underappreciated role in shaping perceptions of Christianity. Movies, television shows, and books often portray religious characters as hypocritical, narrow-minded, or extremist. While these portrayals sometimes reflect real problems within religious communities, they also contribute to cultural narratives that make religious participation seem unappealing or embarrassing to younger generations. Marriage patterns have shifted in ways that affect church participation. Interfaith marriages, while increasingly common, often result in families that avoid strong religious commitments to prevent conflicts. Single adults, who represent a growing percentage of the population, sometimes feel unwelcome in churches that emphasize family programming, and assume married couples as the norm. The COVID-19 pandemic revealed additional fault lines within religious communities. Disagreements over mask mandates, vaccine requirements, and gathering restrictions created conflicts that drove some people away permanently. Churches that emphasized individual freedom often alienated members who prioritized community health, while churches that implemented strict health measures sometimes lost members who viewed these policies as government overreach. International missions and charitable work, once sources of pride for many Christians, have become more controversial as people recognize the problematic history of missionary activity and the complexity of international aid. Younger Christians particularly struggle with the colonial legacy of Christian missions and may prefer secular humanitarian organizations that they view as more culturally sensitive and effective. The priesthood of all believers, a Protestant principle that emphasizes every Christian's direct relationship with God, has ironically contributed to institutional decline. If individuals can have personal relationships with God without institutional mediation, why are churches necessary? This theological principle, while democratizing religious authority, has undermined arguments for institutional participation. Financial transparency has become a significant issue for many congregations. Church members increasingly expect detailed financial reporting and accountability for how their donations are used. Churches that resist transparency or use funds in ways that seem inappropriate often face membership losses. Conversely, churches that embrace financial openness sometimes discover that transparency creates new conflicts over spending priorities. The therapeutic culture's emphasis on individual wellness and self-care sometimes conflicts with traditional Christian teachings about sacrifice, service, and submission to divine authority. People seeking spiritual practices that make them feel good may find traditional Christianity's emphasis on sin, repentance, and moral obligation uncomfortable or psychologically harmful. If you found this exploration of religious decline in America insightful, I'd really appreciate a super thanks to help support the channel. These deep dives take significant research and time to produce, and your support allows us to continue bringing you quality historical analysis of contemporary issues. As we look toward the future, several scenarios seem possible for American Christianity. Some denominations may continue declining until they represent small, committed minorities, similar to European Christianity today. Others might adapt successfully to contemporary culture by embracing progressive values, technological innovation, and new forms of community engagement. A third possibility involves the emergence of entirely new forms of religious expression that combine traditional spiritual elements with contemporary concerns and technologies. The implications of widespread church abandonment extend far beyond religious institutions themselves. Churches have historically provided crucial social services, community organizing, and civic engagement that secular institutions struggle to replace. Food banks, homeless shelters, addiction recovery programs, and disaster relief efforts often depend heavily on religious volunteers and funding. As churches decline, communities may lose these vital support systems without adequate replacements. Political implications are equally significant. Religious institutions have traditionally served as mediating structures between individuals and government, providing alternative sources of authority and identity. As these institutions weaken, people may become more dependent on government services or more susceptible to political extremism. The decline of shared religious values may also make democratic consensus building more difficult. Educational implications deserve consideration as well. Religious institutions have historically operated schools, colleges, and universities that provided alternatives to purely secular education. As religious institutions decline, educational diversity may decrease, potentially limiting intellectual and cultural pluralism. The mental health implications of religious decline remain hotly debated. While some people experience religious trauma and benefit from leaving toxic religious environments, others lose important sources of meaning, community, and coping mechanisms. The relationship between religious participation and psychological well-being is complex and varies significantly among individuals. Economic implications ripple throughout communities as churches close or consolidate. Religious institutions are often significant local employers and property owners. Their decline can affect real estate values, local business activity, and employment opportunities, particularly in smaller communities where churches play outsized economic roles. Cultural implications may be the most profound and hardest to predict. American culture has been deeply shaped by Christian values and institutions for centuries. As this influence wanes, fundamental aspects of American identity, ethics, and social norms may shift in ways that are difficult to anticipate or control. International implications also deserve attention. American Christianity has been a major force in global missions, humanitarian aid, and cultural influence. The decline of American religious institutions may affect international development work, cross-cultural exchanges, and America's soft power abroad. Sarah Martinez, whom we met at the beginning of this story, found her own path forward after leaving St. Michael's Lutheran Church. She now volunteers at a secular nonprofit that provides services to homeless families, finding the sense of purpose and community that her church no longer provided. She still considers herself a person of faith, but she's constructed her spiritual life independently of institutional religion. Her story reflects a broader trend of Americans who maintain spiritual beliefs while rejecting organized religion. This spiritual but not religious category now represents nearly 30% of Americans under 30, suggesting that the future of American spirituality may look very different from its past. The abandonment of churches represents more than just changing religious preferences. It reflects fundamental shifts in how Americans understand authority, community, truth, and meaning. Whether this represents liberation from outdated institutions or the loss of valuable social bonds depends largely on one's perspective and experience. What seems certain is that the religious landscape that shaped American culture for centuries is undergoing its most dramatic transformation in the nation's history. The consequences of this shift will likely reverberate through American society for generations to come, affecting everything from politics and education to mental health and community cohesion. Understanding why so many people feel abandoned by their churches requires recognizing that this abandonment often flows both ways. Many churches have also abandoned their traditional roles as sources of comfort for the suffering, advocates for justice, and builders of inclusive communities. When institutions fail to meet people's deepest needs for meaning, belonging, and moral guidance, people naturally look elsewhere. The challenge facing American Christianity is whether it can reform quickly enough to reclaim relevance in a rapidly changing culture, or whether it will continue declining until it resembles the largely ceremonial role religion plays in much of Europe. The answer may determine not just the future of American religion, but the future of American society itself. For the millions of Americans who have walked away from churches, the journey often involves both loss and liberation. They lose community, tradition, and institutional support, but they gain freedom from dogma, hypocrisy, and institutional control. Whether they ultimately find adequate replacements for what they've lost remains one of the most important questions facing contemporary American society. The story of church abandonment in America is still being written. Its final chapters will depend on whether religious institutions can adapt to contemporary needs and values, whether secular alternatives can provide equivalent sources of meaning and community, and whether American culture can maintain its cohesion without the shared religious foundation that has historically bound it together. As we conclude today's deep dive into this fascinating and complex topic, I hope you've gained new insights into one of the most significant social transformations of our time. The decline of religious institutions touches every aspect of American life, from politics and culture to personal identity and community belonging. Understanding these trends helps us better comprehend not just where we've been, but where we might be heading as a society. Thanks for joining me on Professor Archive today. If you enjoyed this exploration of religious change in America, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell for more historical analysis of contemporary issues. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep exploring the forces that shape our world.